So look, thanks everyone for joining. I'm Shane Workman, Product Manager of Projectal, and today we'll be basically giving a webinar on an introduction to the tool. So we'll be covering what Projectal does and how it works. Now, before we do that, I did want to just spend a moment to look at who Projectal is actually for. We get that question quite a bit. And basically our aim is creative studios. So if you're in VFX, animation, games, virtual production, in advertising, things like that, we've aimed Projectal at you. But the important thing is we've actually aimed it at the management side of the studio. So there's plenty of tools for the creative side, of course, and you're using them all every day. But for the management side, you're pretty much stuck with, spreadsheets or sort of internal tools that you've developed. So what we've done is designed Projectal for the producers, the supervisors, the finance teams, basically the studio leads, anyone that's the business side of being creative. So that's who Projectal's for. Now also, we get, of course, obviously a lot of questions about, what is Projectal? And our general goal with the tool is to help you, like I said, at the management side of the studio. So for the bidding, the planning, the scheduling, basically anything where you need to look at the status of a project or of your crew. And then we've got a whole bunch of tools in the software, and we'll be covering these today, where we look at basically how we can use technology to help improve the way you manage the studio. So we've got a whole bunch of tools for things like, scenario planning, and then just managing all of your crew, and then just scheduling your projects. And again, we're covering some of those things today. And then finally, one of the really core tenets of the tool is to make sure we connect with all of the existing software that you're using in the studio. So if you've got, ftrack or ShotGrid or, HR tools, basically we want to be able to pull any relevant information in from that, and then use Projectal as your sort of key dashboard to give you the health of your projects in the studio. So that basically covers what Projectal does. Now, before we dive in, I just want to say one thing, and I think we covered this a little bit. If you do have questions for us, and we can answer those towards the end of the presentation, basically you just click the little 9 dots down in the bottom of Google Meet, and then go to Q&A, and please ask your questions there. Okay, so let's dive in. What I'll do here is jump into the home screen of Projectal. And our goal here is to basically give you a dashboard for your roles and responsibilities. So here I've logged into our example studio called 90 Pixels, and I'm logged in as Jack, who's head of production. So Jack's dashboard is showing the things that he needs to see, whereas let's say I was a producer, or I had a different role, I was in finance or a resource manager, then you would expect your dashboard to show the things that reflect your day-to-day role. So this is super important. The idea with this is to basically let you, see the information that you need, and then be able to act on any of the prompts or screens that are appearing on your dashboards. Now, let's go back to our default dashboard for Jack and have a look at a couple of the things in here, because we do think that this sort of really highlights how Projectal works. One of the key things, like I said earlier, was connecting with your other tools. So here at this particular studio, they're using ShotGrid. They happen to be using Slack for collaboration, and they're a VFX studio, and they're using Deadline for cloud render. Again, there's a lot of important information in those tools that Projectal can use to help show you the big picture, to give you the information about the studio. And today, as we go through, I'll be covering some of those things. Now, another area that we think really sort of highlights what Projectal is about is this project timeline. One of the things when we were developing the tool and talking to studios was there was really a lot of information buried away in spreadsheets. And there was a real challenge in actually being able to get that information out and put it in front of the people that need it. So for example, if I wanted to go back and say, well, what did we do for Netflix back in 2021, for example, that information is in your studio. It's in spreadsheets or wherever you're keeping that source of truth. The challenge is to be able to look back at that and say, hey, could we use that to inform an upcoming project? It was really hard to find. So the idea with this timeline, for example, is all of the information that is talking about the business of your studio is actually in the timeline, and I can scroll back and forth and drill into any of the projects that we have. So here today, for example, I can see this Ghost Stories project that's being worked on right now for Apple TV+. But then also, just as importantly, we can see projects that are in the pipeline, so stuff that's been awarded or in the bidding phase. And again, you want to know that information so you can say, are we going to have enough crew to put onto those projects, for example? So again, we think this sort of really highlights one of the core concepts behind the tool. And also another one that sort of talks towards this is here with things like our department breakdown and skills breakdown. Again, all of this information you have in the studio today, you've got HR software, for example, and this is telling us, that in HR, we would know that we've got 10 people. The challenge is that you then have to go to HR to get that information. Whereas the idea with Projectal is to basically pull that data from the HR software and present it for those people that need it. So here it's telling us that as of today, we've got 10 people. But let's say, for example, that you've got people on contract and they're coming and going, you've got a lot of freelancers. Here, Projectal again pulls from HR things like your contract dates. So we know when people are available or not. And so again, that's just basically bubbling this information to the surface so that you can find it when you need it, rather than have to go to either the department heads or go and sort of find that data. So, like I said, this is sort of really indicative of the way that Projectal works. Now, the first key module that I'm going to show you is called Planner. And Planner is basically what we see as the big picture. This is sort of telling us who's doing what and when. Now, in a lot of studios, this is sort of done in spreadsheets typically, or you've got calendars or that sort of thing. But the idea with Projectal again, is to pull that information into one point and give you that single sort of source of truth for this particular data. And so here we've got a very simple list of all of your crew down the side of the page, and then across the page we've got a calendar view. Now, where this starts to get interesting, though, is that we're pulling in data from wherever it lives instead of having to make a duplicate of it. So here, for example, you can see we've got all the holiday information that's coming in for this person, Andy. And then also, if Andy is doing something that's not billable, something that you don't bill to a client, here going to training or going to a conference or something like that, that is also shown in the tool. So straight away, when I was looking to pencil Andy in on a particular project, the system's telling us with this sort of warning symbol, hey, Andy's already booked on doing some other things. There's 2 projects and a conference. So here, as a resource planner, you would need to make a decision. Do I need to move this booking to another period? Or indeed, do I pick it up and move it to someone else altogether? So again, the idea with this is to give you the visibility about who's doing what and when. So this is for resource planning. This is pretty straightforward. Where this starts to get really cool, though, is when we then start to overlay other views, other data points that we have available. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to see what the estimated costs were for a project, or what the actual costs have been, or perhaps what utilization has been. These are things that we can simply select and display or switch on and off. So, for example, if I wanted to see what the estimated cost by department was, here in this particular view, what Projectal will show us is a list of all of the departments in the studio, and then across the page, we're actually getting all the costs. Now you think to yourself, okay, well, how are we calculating these costs? Again, this is because we can pull information from different sources. We're pulling HR salary information, so that's already living in HR. And then if you're putting a bid together in Projectal, we combine the two together to say if we've got people in the animation department that have a certain cost, that then can be calculated out. And here we're showing it week over week. So here I can see in the animation department, the week of January at the start of the year, for example, it's just under $5,000 for the costs for the estimated costs for that particular week. Now, we can also display things in different views. You just switch on and off what you'd like to see. So instead of showing costs, for example, perhaps you'd like to see, what's the utilization in a department. And again, that's just a heat map that you can switch on and off. And so this makes it really easy for any relevant team member to see the data that they need for their particular roles and responsibilities. And again, like I said, you don't have to enter in any of these costs. All of these numbers are being driven by whatever the source of truth is, either HR or indeed from shot tracking information. So for example, if you're using ShotGrid or ftrack, Projectal is actually keeping track of the information from, say, ftrack on work effort. So as work is being done, that information is coming into Projectal from timesheets, for example. And then again, we can say, okay, let's just, instead of showing by the estimated costs, let's actually see things like the actual costs. And so again, here we can see that data just by simply switching it on and off. So this is just a really easy way for you to be able to see all of the information that the studio has in terms of big picture. So this is looking at any of the time ranges that you need in the scales and times that you need. Now, for those of you on the call that cover perhaps in IT, or you need to manage the actual resources that your crew needs, Projectal can also do that. So here, for example, if I go to the resource tab, instead of listing people, your staff, I'm actually listing the equipment that they may need to do their job. And so here, for example, in this particular studio, I can see they've got some camera equipment, and indeed I can actually see where there's a problem. Here, for example, we can see that in May, we actually have got one camera available, but here there's overlap with 2 projects and there's some training. So again, this is just basically giving you a decision point. What do you need to do here? Do I need to go and hire equipment, additional equipment, or do I need to move the schedule around to be able to allocate this? But again, the only way you know this is if you're getting visibility, if you're getting that information, and this is what Projectal is designed to give you. And indeed, with things like cloud render, for example, for anyone on the call that is either got their own render farms or is doing it in the cloud now, you've got set numbers of credits, for example, on deadline. You want to know, based on the amount of work that you're doing, are we going to have any hotspots? And here, indeed, for example, in June and July, I can see that we are. It's planned to use more credits than we actually have available. So again, are just data points that Projectal can keep track of. So that's the big picture view. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into some of the detail, so into the actual projects themselves. So to do that, I've clicked on Projects in the left-hand menu, and you'll notice you get these card views that show you the projects and their current progress. So here I can see the Digital Fugitive project, for example, we're 43% complete. But importantly, I'm keeping track of the budget versus actual. So you've got the awarded budget, and then because we're actually getting work effort from, say, ShotGrid or ftrack or Kitsu or whatever tool you're using, that information is being overlaid with the salary information that's coming from HR, so we can actually get a live budget versus actual. So that information is being driven as the project is being updated. Now, let's actually drill into a project. I'll jump into this Hollow Justice project. And here, for this particular work, it's actually some artwork for Netflix games. And here we can see some basic key information about the project. Again, these dashboards are tailored based on what you need to see. This, for a producer, is showing all of the data for their particular project. And here we can see who the customer is. We can see if there's any rebates that are being applied. Perhaps you get government incentives, for example, if you've got locations up in BC, for example, or Canada areas. We can see that data. And then also we're getting this live budget versus actual. So here we can see the awarded budget. We can see the estimated cost with margins. And then we've got the planned and actual budget to date. So again, that information is being driven as the project is being completed. And then also, of course, we have some things, again, for the management side of the studio, things like task alerts. Now, the artists, they are doing work in ShotGrid or ftrack, for example. They continue using those tools. But here in Projectal, you're actually seeing where there's any particular challenges or problems. And in this case, there's a couple of tasks that are over budget. So that's the dashboard view. Now, of course, you can also drill in to the actual tasks themselves. So here, if I click on tasks, this gives me more of the traditional view that you would have in your shot tracking tool, like I said, like ShotGrid or ftrack. And indeed, columns of information here are coming from those tools. The timesheet information is coming from those tools. So here, for example, I can see in this particular view, we have a concept art task that was slated to be 12 days. That was what our bid duration was, 12 days. But I can actually see coming from, in this case, ShotGrid, the artist has actually spent 18 days on that task. So straight away, the system will actually give us warnings. It will say, hey, you estimated this to be 12 days, but the actual duration has been 18 days. And so the system is bubbling that up for us and telling us where there's any problems. And also, all of the costs are being shown here. So we know, based on the person's salary, that should have cost $4,000 for 12 days of work. However, because they spent 18 days, we can actually see that we've gone over budget here. And again, the system is telling us that. It's bubbling that information up for us. So this is really good because from a report perspective, I can learn from this information, and indeed the system learns from this information, so that if you're doing work in the concept department in the future, for example, you would know that, hey, traditionally we might have to push the bid out a little bit here because looking at the previous projects, the system's telling us that they're always over time. And so again, you want to have that information bubbled up so that you can decide how you're going to act on that. So that's a task list view. Really, you can see a lot of data here showing you who's doing what, when. And also, like I said, because we're connecting with the tools that the artists are actually using, any things like chronological notes, screenshots, images that are being passed back and forth, that's pulled into Projectal dynamically. So if an artist, who's in ShotGrid in this case, Daniel, puts a note in, that will be pulled into Projectal dynamically. And if you as the producer reply back to that, that will be pushed to ShotGrid dynamically. And again, that just happens in real time. So any changes made in one tool are reflected in the other. Now also, let's just have a quick look at some of the other views you can have when you're managing a project. Another view is a Gantt view. And so here, for example, is a traditional Gantt chart where you're actually seeing the structure and dependencies of the project. And again, this is being generated dynamically from the tasks. So we know, of course, when things are starting and finishing, and then if there's any dependencies. And this is all live. So even though we're a web-based tool, you can jump in and change any of your dependencies just by drag and drop. So it works just like a desktop application on your regular computer. But you could be doing this on your tablet or your phone, or indeed on, as we're doing here, in our browser. Now, we also have a staff usage view, and this is very similar to, we just had a quick question, a creative sector here. This particular studio is a VFX studio, but they've also got a subsidiary that does some games work. So this particular project here is creating artwork for a game studio. This studio has been contracted to do the artwork for it and audio work. So here in the staff usage view, we're actually getting a heat map and again, seeing where there's problems. So here, immediately, I can actually see we've got a problem. We've got work for 2 people here when we only have 1 person available. Now, if I expand this out, I can actually see what the problem is. And so here I can see Paul William. He's been given 2 days of work with only 1 day of availability. Now, this is actually a fairly simple fix. I could say, hey, let's just drag this task out to another time period. But let's say it's critical to get it delivered in this particular week. You need to make a decision. You need to decide, are we going to push the project out? Are we going to throw some additional people on it? These are scenarios. You need to come up with different scenarios to fix this. Now, before Projectal, you would do this in a spreadsheet typically. You'd have a plan and you'd make a copy of the spreadsheet and you'd decide how you're going to modify it. And then, of course, you've got 3 different spreadsheets or 4 different spreadsheets. You never know which one's the most current one. In Projectal, we have a really cool way of handling this, and we call it sandboxes. And in here, basically, you can come up with a private playground, if you like, for you to be able to test different scenarios before you make it live, before you publish it back to the rest of the system. And so here we've created a sandbox to try a different scenario. And in this scenario, we're going to hire some freelancers. And so here, if I look at this particular scenario, you can see that the plan is now all in the green. We've fixed the problem. And to fix it, we actually threw some freelancers in and gave them the work. Now, the challenge, of course, is that that's going to cost more money. So you need to decide now, am I going to go back to the client or whatever? But the important thing with Projectal is because we're calculating this as you make changes, if I go back to my dashboard, we'll see that the budget with adding the freelancers would need to be $401,000. Whereas if I flip back to the live version, the one that's currently everyone's working from, we can see that the budget would be 389. So straight away, I can try different scenarios out and see that across the whole software. You're basically making changes here, deciding how they're going to be implemented. And if you're happy with it, if we just go back to that sandbox, I can then say, okay, well, let's now publish that back into the live system. So the important thing here is that when I'm working in a sandbox, no one else needs to see it. Of course, I can share it with people. I can say, well, I might want to share it with John or Mary or whoever so that they can decide on the plan as well. But importantly, it's not pushing to HR, it's not pushing to ShotGrid or ftrack. You're only working on this in your own sandbox. But when you're happy with the plan, you can then say, okay, let's now publish this back into the live system. So that would automatically notify the freelancers in whatever tool they're using. It would notify the HR that they need to start hiring, whatever it is. That process of publishing then pushes that back into the live system. And this can be used across all parts of the software. Let's say that the studio's determining whether they want to expand or to move into another location or buy another studio. You can actually create scenarios for all of these plans and decide how it's going to be implemented, both in terms of costs and also just the overheads that it's going to tax onto the studio itself. So this is a really powerful way to get out of spreadsheets. You can do this in the software, it happens instantaneously, and you can really make decisions based on how you wish to work. And so the sandboxing and scenario planning is a really powerful feature of the tool. Now, it doesn't just have to be in looking forward. Obviously with scenario planning, you're looking at plans for the future. We can also use this to look back. We can actually learn what went wrong with projects, for example, or what changes have been made. And to do this, there's a few different ways, but the easiest way is to use what we call a data view. And this is another module of the software we'll drill into now. The idea with this is to basically report on any of the data we have access to. So here, if I go back to what's live in Projectal today, I can see that this particular studio, this VFX studio, has 133 people, and they've actually got that subsidiary I just mentioned that did the games work. They've got 31 people. Clownfish is a contractor, they've got 7 people, and Loudmouth has got 21 people. So this is the information as of today. But the cool thing in Projectal is that we're keeping track of information as it actually changes. So if HR reports that the headcounts have changed, for example, or you've purchased another studio or you've expanded, whatever it happens to be, I can just drill back at data at any particular point in time using our time machine. So here I can say, let's actually go back, for example, to 2024. Maybe we go back to January 1st, 2024. And now the data that's shown will be reflecting what it was in January 2024. And so here we can see that the studio hadn't actually purchased that subsidiary Burst Games, and we only had 87 people. And the cool thing is, the whole software is now showing information from back in 2024. So if I go to projects, for example, I can see that we're showing all of the projects that were being worked on in 2024, which of course is going to be different to what is today, the live system that we're actually working on. So this is a really powerful way for you to be able to drill into data and get the sorts of information that you need. Now, I can also use the reporting to look forward as well. I can say, hey, based on people that are being onboarded next week, what sort of software licenses are we going to need? Or how many computer leases do we need for people that are coming in? Here, for example, it's a really simple report telling me what software licenses we have, what computer leases we have, and then how many people are actually using those today. And any numeric data that you have in the system can be charted. So as long as you've got numeric data, Projectal can create charts. And the cool thing is that then becomes part of your dashboard. So let's say, for example, that I'm in finance. I can come in here and say, okay, let me actually look at a finance dashboard, for example. And so, if I'm in finance, I don't need to see the detail about tasks. I just want to see top level data. Here, I can see the awarded costs of projects, the estimated cost, the actual costs. This is just a report that the system can generate dynamically. And again, all of the charts that are here, these are generated dynamically as well. So again, just a really simple way to show the information that you need and basically get data reflected in the way that you need to see it day to day. So that concludes basically the general overview of Projectal. Hopefully you can see that it covers anything on the business or management side of the studio. You're covering the things you need to see from a tracking perspective, from a reporting, from a planning, bidding perspective. It's the management side of the studio that Projectal is aimed at. So thanks for looking at the software. Let's jump in now into to Q&A. I'll just go to the Q&A tab in our browser, and I'll see a few questions that are asked here. One of the questions that was sent in was, how long has Projectal been around? The software's been in release. It's a relatively new tool. It's been about 4 years now. And we're in a bunch of different studio types. We started in VFX, but has also now merged in or gone into animation, game studios. We've got a lot of work in virtual production, advertising agencies. It's sort of a real mix of clients. But basically, part of the onboarding of the software is that we would work with you to basically, one of the next questions was, how long does it take to roll out at a studio? We basically work with the studio and first off determine what you need to connect with. So, for example, if you have the question here was, does it connect to ftrack? Yes, it does. Let's say that you've got an ftrack setup. Projectal will basically, our onboarding team will work with you to say, okay, what is your ftrack setup? What do we need to bring in? And then we'll also connect to your other tools like ftrack, like HR tools and things like that, to again pull that information in so the data can flow back and forth between the tools. And typically from a rollout perspective, you're anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 weeks to get the software set up and installed in the studio and get everyone trained. So of course we need to do training and that sort of thing to pull that data in. We had a question about data coming in from many sources. Yes, our webhooks or our connectors actually let you pull data from Projectal as well, and indeed a lot of studios do that. Now, at a very basic level, you can also just spit it out as a spreadsheet. So if you just need to get data out very quickly in the software, any of the screens, if I'm back in Projectal itself, any of the screens that you have, I can do a export. And so if I'm in a project and I want to spit out some tasks, for example, you'll notice that there's an import and export button on the toolbar to get that. And or if you want to do it from webhooks, we've got a full API that lets you talk to any part of the software. And indeed, our interface, what you're actually seeing here, is written using that same API. So basically, if we can pull it, you can pull it to get data in and out of the system. So I had also a question about data coming in from ShotGrid or ftrack. If you're not using tools like that, of course, you can enter it directly in the software. So, if I want to go and create a new project, it's very straightforward to do. One of the upcoming webinars will be talking about perhaps bidding and the bidding and budgeting process where you actually create a project from scratch. But also we have a lot of studios that are just using the software directly and are basically using it to manage things like all of their staff. So if they don't have HR software, for example, it's very straightforward for me in the management screen under staff. Typically if you can pull this from HR, we would pull it in. But if you don't, I can enter this information in directly into the tool. Okay, so I know we've sort of hit our half hour, so thank you everyone who's joined. Do we have any final questions? Actually, I think I see one here. Yeah, we had a question about whether we can upload budgets and data from software like Showbiz and Movie Magic. Yes, the best way is if there's an API. So if we can pull the data in from an API dynamically, that's the best way, because then you're not having to sort of handle any, even though we have machine learning in the software to bring in from spreadsheets, API is the best way. However, if you've got a printed out spreadsheet saved as an Excel file, for example, from Movie Magic, Projectal can use its machine learning, again, one of the other AI functionalities in the software. We can use our machine learning to pull that data in and then populate a project with that. So you've got both ways. API is preferred. Okay, we have another question. Yes, this is being recorded, and we will absolutely share it with everyone who was registered today. So, any other questions before we finish up?
I think I'll just jump in for 1 second. So
sure.
I just posted my name's Reese. I just posted a few links there for you guys as well, which if you've got any questions that are sort of more technical, you can delve into the developer tools and the help desk. There's a lot of information online about Projectal and how it works. But also feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to do a customized demonstration, when it's convenient for everyone. And yeah, so please just reach out to us, and we'll set up a meeting with you.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks so much for everyone that joined. Yeah, sorry, Reese.
Ahmed just asked a question.
Oh, yeah. How's it priced? Reese, would you like to cover that?
Yeah, so like with all SaaS services, there's a per seat fee, and the connectors are just based on what the requirements are for that connector. So we'll do a customized pricing for each person, but yeah, the basic is per seat, and then we go into the more technical connector fees and things like that.
Excellent. Thank you, Reese. So like I said, I wanted to keep it as short as possible. So thanks everyone so much for your time today, and we'll send out the recording after the call. But thanks for joining this webinar.